US President Donald Trump has slapped the European Union and Mexico with a 30% tariff on their goods after weeks of negotiations failed to reach a comprehensive deal. Now, for reaction to the impact of the 30% tariffs on South Africa, let's now speak to the African United Business Confederation President George Sebulela. And Dr. Sebulela, thank you so much for your time and for joining us this evening. Now, as the AUBC, your vision is to foster economic growth as well as promoting trade investment and also seeing the interests of business amongst businesses in Africa. What impact do you think that this 30% will now have specifically on South African exporters and jobs?
Thank you so much for inviting us. Indeed, it's a greater concern. We mustn't take into consideration that the US is really the biggest market in the world, followed by China. And imposing 30% to this tariff to the South African, to South Africa, create a difficult challenge. One is, let's understand that there's large automobiles or motor manufacturing in South Africa, such as BMW, Mercedes-Benz, VW, that are exporting from South Africa. Secondly, we know that the agricultural products, such as citrus, wine, macadamia nuts, and so on, also export to the US. The mining and minerals industry, platinum, as you know, we export large amount of platinum, manganese, and iron ore to the US. Then obviously the manufacturing industry, the machinery and chemicals also exported to the US. Now you can imagine that this is going to create a huge amount of loss of revenue and jobs. And unfortunately, in order for us to be able to overcome the challenge, it's going to be extremely, very, very difficult. Now, what we're going to also see, we're going to see a lot of diversion of investment that was supposed to come to South Africa through foreign direct investment being diverted to other competing markets. Because as you know, South Africa is also competing with other markets such as the EU, China, other African countries, and so on. And therefore, we're going to see now people beginning to say, we rather focus where we know that we will see a return on investment. And we also would really directly get impacted by even the investment and business confidence, which currently, as you know, South Africa already is under pressure through FATF, which has already listed South Africa as one of the high-risk countries to invest because of money laundering issues and so on. And that's the challenge the government of South Africa has been carrying currently. And this ultimately will have a direct impact even on the currency, the exchange rate of South Africa. So we do really see quite a lot of impact that is going to be felt by a multiple of different industries, including the SMMEs over time, because this is a value chain impact across the entire industry sectors.
I mean, some have said that maybe this could be a time for South Africa to reconfigure, certainly focus on BRICS and the Africa Free Trade Agreement in ensuring that we tighten those relationships and make sure that over time we are then not impacted by these tariffs. Do you think that this is a plausible argument, especially in the immediate future?
It is obviously a common cause that any country strategically has to look in a diverse markets all over the world. And that already tries to position a country to try and minimize risks, such as what we see currently. Now, you have the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which in fact the African countries are not trading as much as they're supposed to do on their own. There are multiple of challenges that we already know what is happening in the African infrastructure in totality to make trade to become much more efficient. However, this is the time for the African Union and the business leaders to come together to say, we need now to build our own economy. Secondly, we want to see South Africa now to diversify also to the European market in a larger number. And that always create an alternative. Similarly, with China being the second largest economy in the world, has the biggest opportunity. As you know, that South Africa already export quite a large number of goods, even probably more than even the US. China is already our leading trading partner in terms of multiple of goods. Yes, indeed. The strategy is diversification, but that doesn't mean you can exclude US immediately. And that's the challenge I think the South African government is going to face.
You spoke about a challenge of trading amongst ourselves as African countries, but what sort of interventions do you think need to take place within South Africa between business and government in ensuring that we protect our economic interests?
Look, as I say, the challenges with Africa at this stage, its reliance on how quickly also other countries in Africa are going to develop. As you know, as I've mentioned already, it costs more to move goods from South Africa to an African country than moving them into Europe or in the US country. And that's purely because of the policies that already are not made in such a way that they are acceptable from one country to another. I mean, we already talked about why we don't have visa-free countries to allow investment to move from one country to another. Why don't we harmonize the policies of the ports to ensure that all African countries becomes much more easier when they have to deal with one another? And why don't we also make sure that the infrastructure is integrated, as opposed to one country has a one established infrastructure and the other one has got a substandard infrastructure, and a number of issues. And fourthly, you find that there's also a greater challenges when it comes to security and corruption in multiple of different African countries. And this is where the political leadership comes in to say, we are now going to harmonize our countries. We are now going to make sure that whichever country is well established can share skill, capacity, and capital in making sure that Africa becomes what it's supposed to, be.
Speaking of that political will, are there any appeals that, as an organization, as AUBC, that you are making to regional blocs and the African Union in ensuring that they stand with South Africa in seeing the impact that this could then have for the rest of the continent?
Yes, our engagement has always been through the African Business Council, which is part of the African Union. And we have been engaging on a number of quite issues to say what makes it easier to develop economically, what makes it easier for business to be able to trade in the various African countries. And we have mobilized different organizations in different countries, in Botswana, in Cote d'Ivoire, and so on, in order to present our challenges and progress to different political platforms such as the African Union. That's the platform and the process that we can follow. But politically, it really depends on each and every country's leadership on a political at a political level.
I mean, we're seeing that these tariffs have also been imposed on Europe as well as Mexico, in spite of those talks that have now fallen through. What more do you think needs to be done by South Africa in terms of engagement with the US?
Look, I think that process has already started through the Minister of DTIC, and that discussion, unfortunately, was streamlined mainly into AGOA and other potential trade opportunities that could exist between the two countries. I do not believe that the US is negotiating in good faith. The intention of the U.S. at this present moment is to build industrial capacity of the U.S. The only thing that they want to see other markets doing is to rely on import of goods from the U.S. If you notice, the announcement of the president of the U.S. says, if you keen and willing to come and set up a manufacturing in the U.S., you would not be charged any tariffs. That already tells you which direction he's pushing. He's saying, I'm building my own internal capacity. You must be dependent on me. Unfortunately, for a country like South Africa as an emerging market, we need to build our own industrial capacity. And we can only do that when we are able to export, not only to import, but we are able to export the goods that we produce. And markets such as the US is really well positioned to really grow our country. And I would have expected the president of the US to understand that the history of South Africa is not only about deal making. It's got a history of apartheid, a history of struggle, a history of unemployment that need to be dealt with. Unfortunately, we find ourselves negotiating on a deal-by-deal basis without really taking into consideration the developmental objectives of South Africa and Africa. And that's the problem that I see today.
Dr. Sebulela, thank you so much for your time and for joining us this evening. We certainly are going to be getting a lot more reactions coming to the 1st of August when the US then imposes that 30% tariff on South African goods. Thank you so much for your time this evening. That's the AUBC President, George Sebulela.